Welcome to the Good Food CFO podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Delavan, and with me, as always, is our producer, Chelsea Steer.
Hey, Sarah, I have a new review for you today.
One of my favorite things.
Yeah, so this review is from Apple Podcasts. It comes from our listener, Cassie of Cassie's Cupboard. And she said, full of great food biz money info. Whether you need help with budgeting or just making sure you are following your own vision, Sarah has a great podcast and community for you. I love that she is challenging the old ways of distribution and big biz retail. She gives you the support that you need to do business your way.
That is such a great review. First of all, thank you so much, Cassie, for that. Cassie is, I'll say, like an active and vocal member of our community who's been around for a couple of years now. I feel like has an amazing business based in Ohio. And from what I can tell and see through the social medias, is truly building a business on her own terms. So thank you, Cassie, so much for that amazing review.
Yeah, like you said, she is very vocal. We hear from Cassie all the time. If she loves an episode, she emails us and
Yes.
tells us. We love hearing that. Gives us a lot of feedback on if what we're saying is striking a chord or not, right? So we love that. And as you mentioned, she does have a local business in Ohio selling soup mixes, spices, like other pantry staples. And yeah, definitely doing it on her own terms. So yeah, thanks, Cassie. And remember, if you leave us a review on Apple, be sure to tell us your business name and about yourself so that we can shout you out here on the podcast as well. Okay, Sarah, I wanted to share an article with you today.
Okay.
This article really struck a chord with me, first of all, or like really caught my eye because it name dropped someone from my past.
Okay.
So I was immediately interested. But then I think it also touched on something that we talk about here all the time, right? Which is transparency.
Hmm.
So the article is titled Tony's Chocolonely Secures Deal with Howard Schultz. And we're going to link to this in the show notes like we always do. But I thought this was really a kind of an interesting story for me personally, right? Because for people who may not know, Howard Schultz is the former CEO and founder of Starbucks, where I spent 12 wonderful years of my career. And he has recently invested in and become a minority shareholder in Tony's Chocolonely, which is, yeah, is a really funny name to say, really fun to say. But Tony's Chocolonely is a Netherlands-based chocolate company that is focused on ethically producing chocolate and ending exploitation in cocoa. And I know that Howard Schultz has been in the news a lot over the past few years, especially when he, came back to Starbucks. And there might be some mixed opinions about him as a person. But one thing that I got really excited about when I saw this partnership is that something that I know, having worked inside the company, is he's very focused on environmental impacts, protections, et cetera, of companies. And so I think that this is a really great partnership. And Tony's Chocolonely actually said themselves, I'm quoting here from kind of their press release, is that we are proud to welcome Howard Schultz as an investor in the company. And we are looking forward to drawing on his extensive experience of building a global consumer brand and company. Tony's rapid growth, rising popularity with US consumers, and increased investor interest demonstrates that building a company that balances shareholder returns with its impact on people and planet is not only the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do for companies today.
Yeah. I love that you bring this article to the podcast because to me, it represents a success story, right? Looking into Tony, who's not from the US and whose real name is spelled Teun, and I think it's pronounced Tune, but I'm not 100% sure. He's a Dutch journalist.
Yeah.
And the company came to be like so many good food businesses that we work with and that listen to this podcast because he identified a problem, a very big problem, namely forced labor in the chocolate industry. And as a journalist, they say on the website it's kind of like the 60 minutes of food, in his country. And so he, dug into the story and then felt like there was more that he could do or should do. And he had a couple interesting failed attempts at trying to make his point. Um,
Yeah.
but he ended up making, I think it was 5,000. Let me look and see here. Yeah, 5,000 fair trade, fully like 100% traceable milk chocolate bars. And each one was wrapped in a bright red package. And if you don't know this about Tony's, it's also cut unevenly, right? To represent the inequitability within the industry. And so this product is full of transparency. It's full of message. It's full of mission,
Yeah.
right? And to be quite frank, according to their website, it says it wasn't supposed to be a business. It was supposed to be a one-off kind of a thing to spread the word about what was going on in the industry. But it was a hit, and the demand, once they created the awareness, the demand was there. And I think there can be a lot to learn for myself. I will say, like, reading their website, I thought to myself, like, wow, us as a mission driven business
Mhm.
and the way that we communicate and the way that we connect, like, delicious products in their case, right, to a mission. We want to be entertaining and also informative, right? Like, what are, like, there's like these dualities in,
Yeah.
right, in mission driven businesses where we're doing good, and we also need to make money to continue to do it. We also want to have a product that is enjoyable for people to consume however they consume it, right? And Tony's has, I think it's three pillars: raising awareness, leading by example, and inspiring others to act. And I just thought that, yeah, it's just a great example of how you can do it, how you don't have to put messaging secondary, which is the message that I think, I've heard before is like, I talk about this regenerative fried chicken sandwich, and the method of marketing that founder, took was like, we're selling a delicious and fun sandwich first and foremost. How that chicken is raised is sort of secondary.
Mhm.
Tony's is a business that's saying, no, 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 we're existing for this reason and you should care. And, you know, I think that that's really inspiring. And I also think, as you said, and as the article said, like, the fact that these types of businesses and that Tony's is attracting investment from really big business, I think, there's mixed emotions about that for me, but I think
Yeah.
at the end of the day, when big money goes toward mission driven brands and businesses that can have such a I mean, we're talking about slavery here. Like, let's not
Yeah.
tiptoe around like what they're fighting against, right? Like, that's big and important. And the fact that Mr. Schultz and others are investing in this business and helping to grow it, right? And to increase the amount of chocolate that is produced, like, that's voting with your dollar. Consumers are voting with your dollar, investors are voting with your dollar. And like, I can't be mad at that, right? Like,
Yeah, I think you make a really great point there, because I think the idea is that this is kind of the proof of concept that,
mhm,
yeah, people are voting with their dollar. They do want to buy from companies that stand for something, right?
mhm,
And are making a difference in the world. And I think the kind of part two of this story, and that we'll have to follow along with, and and I think that addresses kind of your maybe unease with big money and big business, is can they sustain that mission and those values on that scale and on that level?
yeah. And I think one sort of promising thing, and I don't have the article in front of me at the moment, but they actually not too long ago instituted basically like ethical guardians. I forget what
Yeah,
exactly they
mission
were. Mission
guardians.
guardians. Thank you. So
Yeah.
these are people who are like essentially responsible for ensuring that the board or anyone like does not erode the standards, the mission, the values of the business as they grow. And I flipping love that. I think it's so amazing. So Yeah, to your point, I think I would love to keep an eye on the story and see, how it pans out and to see, what other ways they continue to, I think, dig into their mission and what they're trying to do. I think it's also really interesting if you dig into the article, you dig into the website a little bit, which I encourage you to do if you're a founder and you just are interested in learning about this. But they've partnered with people who are in what I'll call big chocolate. Calabo, I only know that name because I worked in food for a little while and I worked with pastry chefs and we would order Calabo chocolate, but they partnered with them early on to for proof of concept, proof of traceability, even when working with a big chocolate like processor. I think that's really inspiring too, right? To say, okay, as a emerging brand, as a small brand, we don't have to do it alone. We don't have to carve the path all the time on our own. We can collaborate potentially with an existing business, with someone who is working at scale, but who also believes in our mission and what we're doing, and we can get their support. And so I think that's just another kind of point of interest for me when reading this story and learning more about Tony's.
Yeah. And, Sarah, there's so much about Tony's story that is rooted in transparency,
Uh-huh.
right? And
Yeah.
using transparency to fight against these terrible, terrible practices
Hmm.
in the chocolate industry. And that theme of transparency really kind of goes through to our conversation today as well.
Yeah, I love all the connections that you've created with this sort of news segment today and our overall mission, and then of course the conversation that I had. So I was joined by Peter Gialantzis, who is the Chief Merchandising Officer of Pod Foods, which is a next generation distribution platform for innovative emerging brands. They have been in the news lately as a primary distributor to Foxtrot. Peter is extremely active on LinkedIn. We talk a little bit during our conversation about how we got connected and how I actually met and ended up reaching out to Peter. He is a 25-year veteran of the grocery industry. He has held senior leadership roles at Whole Foods Market, at Lucky's Market, and he's actually worked within KeHE Distributors as well prior to joining Pod Foods. So he has so much knowledge of the industry, not just at the retail level, but also in distribution. And I really loved our conversation. If you as a listener were around when we talked with the founder of Mabel, we just kind of scratched the surface in that conversation about how distributors work and how distributors make money and how important it is to ensure that you as a brand are actually a good customer fit for your distributor. And if you're not, what that means and kind of why the partnership won't work out. And Peter just goes a lot further into that conversation. And we have a really transparent and honest talk
Yeah.
about distribution and I really enjoyed it, and he had to leave for a call, like right at the hour, and it was like, okay, maybe like I'm so I we had so much to talk about, and so I would love to have him back sometime in the future, but I think this episode is really full of helpful
Yeah.
information and insights for listeners.
I'm glad you pointed that out, Sarah, because the episode does end pretty abruptly. So everybody will kind of know what's going on there. But I will say another thing that something that was very clear to me from listening to this conversation is, as you've already talked about Peter's extensive experience, right?
Mhm.
He very clearly has a deep and intimate knowledge of the supply chain.
Yeah.
And I think that bringing that perspective to, our audience of food founders, of good food founders, is really kind of enlightening or like eye opening. And as you said, really giving them the opportunity to understand where they fit into that supply chain.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as with so many things in the industry, it can be easy to sort of demonize or villainize, if that's the right word, certain members. But I think the better way to approach it is to say, what is their business,
Yeah.
right? What is their objective? Whether we're talking about a distributor or an investor or a brand themselves or a consultant or literally anyone, right?
Yeah.
Like to say, what do they need to do to survive? What is their business model? And when I began to really understand that, it's just so helpful to navigate both from the CFO seat and then also from a conversation and sort of investigative standpoint, if you will, as I sit at the podcast desk. And I think the same goes for our listeners. Like, one of the things we're striving to do is help you understand the other side, and Pod Foods is a distributor. I think what makes them different is the level of transparency that they
Yeah.
approach their work with and how clear their mission is. I'm also excited for people to kind of hear about that as well, and to then have one more piece of information and one more like level of knowledge for better decision making in their business, which is always the ultimate goal for us.
Yeah. Well, should we get to it, Sarah?
I think so. Let's do it.
Okay. As a good food founder, do you ever feel like your work is done in a silo? Is it difficult to feel confident in your business and financial decisions because you don't have a sounding board? Well, in our weekly CFO office hours, you'll not only get the chance to work shoulder to shoulder with the Good Food CFO herself, Sarah Delavan, but also with a small group of your peers. Together, you can support each other through the work of building a business on your own terms. Passes are available now on our website. Just visit thegoodfoodcfo.com and click on services. And now back to the show.
Well, Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Happy to be here. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm really excited to talk with you. I like to share with our listeners like how myself and some of my guests meet. And I think ours is a bit of a fun story in a way. I was shared by, I think, no less than 3 people, a post on LinkedIn that I think you shared. It was a founder who had sent an invoice for $2,000 to a distributor and received a check for $2.75 back in the mail. And as it goes, I think, that founder had a bit of fun with it, because I think if you can't cry, then laugh, right? But also it's one example of, I think, a big problem, an issue in our food industry. And I saw your comments and a number of other people's comments, and I thought, wow, this guy and I have a lot in common, and I think we have a lot to talk about. And so I'm so glad that you agreed to come on the podcast and to talk about the industry, talk about your role at Pod Foods, and how you're helping to disrupt this industry a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting because these discussions, whether it's on LinkedIn or industry-wide in general, are a daily occurrence.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that every founder, every emerging brand has to deal with in one way or another. And it was really the genesis of Pod Foods in the first place. So whenever we see this bubbling up, it's right at the core of why Pod Foods was founded and right at the core of our value proposition as a business. So we have to engage. Yeah. It's not tangential to what we do. It's central to what we do. But taking a step back from that a little bit, I'm always quick to point out that the ecosystem that we all work within is an interdependent ecosystem. And it's not so simple as distributor X or distributor Y has some sort of malicious, evil agenda to cause pain and difficulty and suffering for CPG emerging brands, right? It's really much more complex than that and much more deep-rooted than that. What I think everyone agrees on is that there's something broken about the supply chain. Mm-hmm. You hear that almost every day. And what you hear a lot of is, well, someone should come up with a better way. And the reason why no one has come up with a better way to get product from point A to point B on a national scale is because it's not a fundamentally profitable enterprise. It is not an easy process to take the order of product in a warehouse environment and turn that into the chaos of product in a store environment, right? By definition, distribution is the management of chaos
Yeah.
and the management of entropy. And it's messy and it's expensive and there's a lot that can go wrong. And so what we're always quick to point out is that there's underlying root cause issues with the way that national distributors are contracted to work with retailers that makes their business very low margin and very cost ineffective for them to work with a lot of the retailers. And all of the deductions and inside income and alternate revenue streams that they've had to come up with are a response to the fact that they're locked into multi-year money-losing contracts with their retailers. So more often than not, you'll hear us at Pod Foods actually defending our competition, the bigger national distributors, because it's not as simple as them trying to do something that's not right by the brands. It's much deeper than that.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you're saying. I think and also, we have seen what does appear to be malicious activity in some cases, right? We've had coffee brands and other brands on the show where giant orders have been placed and then none of it moves through the distribution and all of the cost then comes back to the brand. Not to say that all of the onus is on the distributor. There are lots of players in that, but it can feel malicious. It can feel like, how are they getting away with this? How are they able to do it? Right. But I agree with you. At the end of the day, no matter what technology exists in our industry around distribution, we're moving pounds, we're moving pallets, right, of product across regions and across the country if we're national brands, and the costs of that are high. And that I don't think will ever go away. There'll be no magical way of distributing product nationally that can make it a super low cost endeavor for a brand or a distributor.
Yeah, fundamentally, it's never going to be a super low cost endeavor for any brand, large or small, to transport product across the United States, right? Even with the best density of all, even with an account like a Publix that has 900 stores in the state of Florida with fantastic density, what you're still fundamentally talking about is roughly $25 boxes of product on average, shipping on trucks, on routes with paid driver labor, paid receiver labor, refrigeration, fuel. It's very expensive no matter how you slice it. And there's not really a solution to that. There is a solution to the opacity and the complexity of the process.
Yeah.
And that's what Pod Foods was created to solve for, is to say a larger brand that has a legal team and a big accounting team and an audit team. And increasingly you see LinkedIn postings for deduction manager at a brand, right? If you're a bigger brand and you have all of those resources, then it's more feasible for you to work with a bigger distributor that has these Byzantine complex processes.
Yeah. I think it's, we had the founder of Mabel on the show, I don't know, a year or so ago, and we talked about this similar idea, but you've taken a much deeper dive into it, which I really appreciate, is that the large distributors, right, in across the country, they're not designed to work with small brands. There's just not a fit there. It just doesn't make sense. And I think, we never want to be super negative and say, never work with a KeHE or never work with a UNFI. But what we say instead is be informed, right? What is the rate of growth that you expect to and can actually support financially if you get into this, let's say, first distribution center, right? And are you going to be able to meet the needs of your customer, which right now is that, the distributor that you've just onboarded with? And I think having that really frank conversation and understanding and saying, I'm not financially prepared to have the kind of growth and scale with this distributor that they would expect me to. They're not the right partner for me. And find a solution is an important thing that founders need to hear and then do.
Yeah. A lot of founders don't know what they don't know.
Mhm.
And it's important that they're getting the right advice in the early stage, right? That might be through a broker, that might be through an advisor, that might be through community.
Mhm.
But oftentimes, what gets a lot of these early stage brands into trouble is jumping at the first opportunity for top line that comes their way. And in some cases, they're pressured into doing that by investors too.
Yep.
But oftentimes, it's just not a fit. It's the square peg into the round hole of this brand is not ready for UNFI with Whole Foods, but they do it anyway.
Yeah.
And it's nobody's fault at the end of the day. It's just, it is a tragedy though, right? And we're trying to avoid that outcome by giving the brands incubation and giving the brands a path to scale. Brands have to be able to build up enough early adopters in the early stages that
Yeah.
they have enough of a customer base. If they make the leap to mainstream, that they've got enough cultural, social awareness to make that leap. And by the time that happens, they will also have enough infrastructure to work with not only a Whole Foods, but for that matter, a Publix, a Kroger, and Albertsons also. They'll have the infrastructure to deal with that, that's success, right? That's really the innovation story in a nutshell, is brands starting at zero and reaching the mainstream, whatever that means for them.
Yeah, I actually had taken a post from LinkedIn on this. You said every brand needs a growth plan for how to, quote, cross the chasm from early adoption without running out of money or time. And that's specifically what you're talking about here, right? Because in that post you talk about needing to have that audience, needing to have that strong customer base. What we talk a lot about here on the podcast and in my work as a CFO is really understanding cash flow, understanding what does your margin look like when you're first starting out and you're selling D2C, right? Understanding how much cash, investment and funding you're going to need to grow to the, quote, next level, whether that's a larger local brand or a regional brand, which I'm a big advocate for food businesses of all sizes. We have many profitable regional brands. We've got lots of profitable local brands, 2-3 locations, or they're just really saturating their market and they're profitable and successful and making an impact locally. And then we also, of course, need to see, better for you brands, innovative brands on the national level. I want to see them infiltrating the big stores like the Publix and the Krogers and things like that. But I think the biggest issue faced by founders and brands is running out of money, or sort of that running out of money and time, right? That like they both have to work together so perfectly. And what we strive to do is give brands the foresight and founders the foresight of going, this is what's realistic with the money that I have, and I'm going to need more, or, how do we structure the business so that the goals that I want to achieve can actually happen?
The hardest part of that for a lot of these brands is any unexpected expense, right? If you have a finite amount of money and you're planning for a certain cash flow,
Mm-hmm.
and then suddenly there's a deviation from that plan and not a good one,
Mhm.
you could find yourself in a cash crunch very quickly as an emerging brand. And that's more often than not what you hear. You hear from brands saying, I got this deduction this month for this many dollars. OMG, what happened? And if you really dissect that, more often than not, there is an explanation
Yeah.
for it. There is a 19-page document that every brand signs when they onboard to UNFI or KeHE. And in the fine print of that policies and procedures document, almost all of the time, there's some explanation for those deductions, but it's a labyrinth for a small brand to navigate if they
Yeah.
don't have the experience or the resources to navigate it. And so if they wake up today expecting positive cash flow, but 2 weeks from now there's a surprise $30,000 deduction,
Yeah.
they might not be able to make payroll or pay their co-manufacturer, and that could put them into a lot of trouble very quickly. So what Pod Foods has tried to do is to just take any of those surprises and those uncertainties out of the business model and just lay out all of the costs up front. And in some cases, we have had brands say, well, I don't know, this seems pretty expensive
Mhm.
because the amount of money that you're charging up front seems higher than what the markup structure would be at another distributor.
Yeah.
And I always carry a Boomerang on my desk. I have a Boomerang sitting on my desk at all times. And I show the brands the Boomerang and I say, look, this is okay. We totally understand. We've laid out the cost basis of what it costs to do business with us. It's not a random number. It's
Yeah.
A, the number that we need in order to function as a business, but B, it's roughly equivalent to the all-in expense of doing business with other national distributors. And when the brands boomerang back to us after a negative experience at UNFI or KeHE, we're there for them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that happens all the time. But
Yeah.
it's just the certainty, the cost certainty that a lot of these brands need, because then they'll be able to say, well, wait a minute, I can't afford to go into Publix right
Yeah.
now for an example.
Yeah.
I'm going to say no to this opportunity, and I might say yes at some point in the future, but for now I'm going to pass.
Yeah.
That's great. That's success because we've given the brand that foresight to be able to make that decision.
Yeah. And I'll share a story that happened with one of the brands that I was consulting for. They wanted to expand into Texas from a different state. And I'm sure the documentation has changed, but I'll say that at the time, we had a Pod Foods contract or whatever, and all of the fees are laid out in a chart. And it's very explicit. These are the storage fees. These are the handling fees. This is when the handling fees get charged. If you have a cold or frozen product, this is how it differs from a room temp product. We knew that we had to cover the shipping costs to get, the product to Texas. And even that, like some people, I've heard some people go, but I have to cover the shipping to get it. You're going to pay KeHE or UNFI to come pick up your product and take it to their distribution center. To echo what you just said, the only difference there is that they're not going to be so upfront and transparent and clear about what their cost to move that product is. And
Right.
and that's another thing that we've seen. I've had founders pour over the numbers, see a presentation, think that they understand this is what it's going to cost to have the distributor come to me, pick up my product and bring it to the distribution center. And then the chargebacks on that, the deductions on that are massively larger than they expected them to be.
Freight is the most misunderstood, particularly inbound freight is the most misunderstood part of our business, of the industry.
Mm-hmm.
When I was at KeHE, it took me years to understand it, even
Yeah.
from the inside. And inbound freight is a major profit center for UNFI and KeHE. There's a freight pad that's on all of the inbounds to cover the expense and then some. And it's just a source of profit. And it's understandable because the contracts on the outbound to the customers are money losing contracts in most
Right.
cases. So there has to be profit somewhere, but that's a big source of that profit. And often, or almost all of the time, the brand doesn't have visibility to that.
Yeah.
So the brand doesn't know how much freight expense is being added to their product, and often doesn't know what the retailer is actually paying.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not a line of sight to that. What we've done is just stripped all of that away. So the retailer and the brand know exactly what the cost is, and we don't have any markup at all. And there's nothing that gets in the middle of that.
Yeah.
Freight, though, is still the biggest obstacle, much more than storage, much more than any of the outbound. It's the inbound transportation, because what most brands have is they have a very inefficient logistics network, even before the product ever gets to their distributor.
Right.
And a lot of them haven't thought about this enough and optimized this. So we have brands with 3PL locations all over the country. We have brands with 3PL in Utah, and almost all of their businesses in California.
Right.
We have brands with 3PLs in Kentucky, and almost all of their businesses on the West Coast. And so if you think about that, if you're having product coming from a co-manufacturer, inbounding it to a 3PL, and then inbounding it again to a distributor,
Mm-hmm.
you're paying freight twice before you even get any chance at selling it. So we're trying to help brands with that. We're trying to evolve our model and take it a step further. Number one, we've got a program called Pod Freight that we've been running for a while, but we're going to start to market a little bit better now, which is to say, why not just run your inbound freight through the pod ecosystem,
Mm-hmm.
use the economies of scale of all of your fellow emerging brands,
Mm-hmm.
and let's put 10 small brands onto one truck, all moving from Southern California to Northern California at the same time,
Right.
instead of 10 different brands having 10 different LTL carriers and paying $300 a pallet to do that.
Yeah.
So we're trying to help brands with that. And then we're also trying to connect brands with our warehousing partners for 3PL solutions.
Okay.
Because there's brands that have 3PLs that are 5 miles away from a Pod Foods warehouse.
Mm.
They could co-locate their 3PL with a Pod Foods warehouse and do all of the D2C work or the other 3PL business that needs to be done outside of Pod. They could co-locate that together, and the inbound freight at that point becomes zero.
Right.
And so this is like, we're just trying to think about this like a holistic ecosystem for the brands, even if the brands aren't asking for it. We're trying to solve the problem before it becomes a problem and make it easier for them to run their business.
Yeah. I think, we've talked to lots of founders who say, that I think you called it a chasm, right? Crossing the chasm. That's the hardest part because there's no infrastructure currently to do that, right? On the production level, that's an issue. We've talked about meat processing and grain processing and production and co-packing. And, at all of these important points of production and creating a product and shipping a product, there's a lack of infrastructure between I'm just getting started and I'm teeny tiny and I'm a national brand. And so it's good to hear, what Pod Foods is doing. And, there's some other companies doing different things out there too, but to, utilize the economies of scale and really bring brands together to help shrink that chasm a little bit, right? Especially in the financial sense of thing. Because I think the other thing that the brands that you work with and that I work with have in common is that the price of their product is typically higher than the average comparable product on a typical grocery store shelf. And that is true for a variety of reasons. And one of those reasons is also the freight and all
Yeah.
of those additional costs that are a part of the process of delivering the product that don't have anything to do with the actual production of the product itself, but that have to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, freight is the biggest. There's a lot of examples. Every little line item expense for a smaller brand is higher in
Yeah.
percentage terms, right? Cardboard boxes are more expensive for a small brand than they are for a bigger brand also. But
Mhm.
the freight line, what a lot of brands don't realize, and even a lot of retailers don't realize, is that there's more quote unquote markup in the freight than there is in the markup itself of a UNFI KeHE contract with a Sprouts or a Whole Foods.
Right.
That markup percentage that's built into the UNFI Whole Foods contract is a smaller dollar amount per case than the inbound freight. So there's a lot more wiggle room or optimization to be had
Yeah.
on the inbound freight than there is on losing sleep over this account has this markup and this account has that markup. It's an easy, shiny object for people to glom onto. Even a lot of retail buyers I used to be a retail buyer for many years, and it's easy to get distracted by the markup percentage and lose focus on what am I actually paying
Yeah.
for the product, right? And as a founder, as an emerging brand founder, that's what matters. What is the retailer actually paying for the product?
Mm-hmm.
Because really, we're all working backwards from the consumer. The consumer is only going to tolerate a certain SRP for a certain product. And if for product X, that's $5.99, that's a fixed number. That can't change. That $5.99 is what it is.
Yep.
Everyone else has to work backwards from that. How do we drive inefficiencies out of the supply chain to make it more possible for each stakeholder to make some profit along the way?
Yeah.
And if inbound freight is too efficient and other overhead processes are too inefficient along the way, then you don't end up with enough margin to be had to maintain that $5.99. When I used to do private label development and product development at Whole Foods, and we always had to start with the end in mind retail.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't do that, you can end up making this really great product that has no market viability and waste a lot of time, right?
Yeah.
And that's what all of these emerging CPG brand founders need to think about. And we have to help them think about it by trying to show them an end-to-end picture of what the supply chain looks like from a cost perspective.
Yeah. We talk about that a lot too. You can have a great product and have an idea. We run into a lot of founders that know what their D2C price is, and they've got what is considered a good margin. It might be 55%, it might be 60%. And they're not thinking even through what is the long-term vision of my business. So what does that margin look like then in a direct wholesale relationship? What does it look like in a distribution relationship? We're not even thinking about freight costs. You know what I mean? We're just looking at price on shelf and what am I backing into as a margin for me? That's an important step one. And I think you're taking it to that next level and saying there's more beyond, like, we got to make sure that actual like shelf price is realistic too, right? For everything that's built in. So at the end of the day, if the brand needs $2 to get the margin that they need, for their plans to work, let's just say, but that's not possible once you go downstream and go through freight and distribution and get to the retailer. You need to know that sooner rather than later. You need to know that before you get to the point where someone tells you it's not going to work and we would have to put the product on shelf for $7.99 and we're not going to do that, then you're screwed.
Right.
Or you say, okay, we'll lower the price by $1 or what have you. And then the brand isn't making any money. They're literally
Right.
losing on the sale of every product. And that doesn't help anybody either.
Right. Sometimes the unit economics just don't work, particularly with products that have a lower case cost, right? Because it really, everything is a function and distribution of case cost. And the lower your case cost is, the more pennies need to be pinched. And if you're producing product on the East Coast and trying to sell it on the West Coast or vice versa, you need to be very careful about what you agree to. We have a lot of brands that have eagerly gone into great retailers, but that are 2,000 miles away from their 3PL and their co-manufacturer.
Yeah.
And they haven't thought through the long-term ramifications of that with a comprehensive strategy.
Yeah. I think you might have said this earlier, but there's always that top line goal, right? And that's often where a founder's eyes go to. My eyes are always on the bottom line, that gross profit line, and then that bottom line. That's what I want to know, is any money hitting one or both of those lines, and how much, or when is it going to hit that ultimate profit line, that net income line? Is it going to be 12 months from now? Is it going to be 24 months, from now? And how do we grow this business in a way where we can maintain, right? We can stay sustainable and continue to grow. It's not all about fast and overnight. I mean, we've learned that time and time again, with a lot of businesses that close, even with incredible funding,
And a lot of times there needs to be a very high level, big picture strategy in order to see a lot of this.
Yep.
If a brand is trying to decide between two co-manufacturers, it's not just the one that has the lower cost. What if one has a slightly higher cost, but it's much closer to all of the target customers that you're trying to reach?
Yep.
When you look at all of the different elements of the supply chain and you look at the total landed cost on the retailer's shelf, backing out from that SRP, the retailer in most of grocery categories are going to take a 40% margin close to it. So that's a known. The SRP is a known. So then you know what that landed cost has to be on the retailer's shelf. If the co-manufacturer is going to cost you 5% more, but you can save 15% on freight, then you're in a much better position to expand your business if you can save that net 10%.
That's a really great point. I don't think anybody's ever talked about that specific sort of analysis here on the podcast. I appreciate that. That's a great, thing for people to think about and to analyze. I think that's great. I think you're hitting on a point where it's like we often look at the cost that's right in front of us, not that full picture.
Right. No, and we see it because I mean, I saw it at KeHE too, but at KeHE, the scale is much larger and there's a much more well-developed, mature hub and spoke process of intercompany transfers across all of the different warehouses. But it's still in there where if somebody is manufacturing product in upstate New York or Vermont, but the lion's share of their business is in Los Angeles, that's a red flag, right? But a lot of brands don't see it as a red flag. They say, well, I've got a great building, I've got a great relationship, and my costs are very low. But then they can't put their finger on why they're not making any money. And a lot of it is just because it's going into transportation.
I was reading in some of my research for our conversation about Pod Foods, and we talked a little bit about the costs and maybe, I'm sure there are resources where founders who are listening can go and learn more, but I wanted to just touch on one more time that I think it's very refreshing. Transparency is a big value that we have here. And I do believe that Pod Foods also shares that value. And, you're very clear about, this is the service fee, this is the handling fee, and this is when a handling fee is incurred. This is how we charge for storage. I don't know if you still have it, but there's some tiers on, depending on how much product you're moving, right? I just kind of want to echo again, that level of transparency is so valuable to founders. And if you run the numbers and you land in that place of like, this doesn't work for me, odds are another distribution or distributor is not gonna work for you, right? So it's an
Right.
opportunity to have a level of transparency and to do that math and to be able to go, what would need to change for this to work? And I
Yeah.
think that's really cool and helpful and something that I want to shout out here.
Well, our business was founded by two really brilliant young women who ran into the same problem that thousands of founders run into, is that they couldn't scale their business profitably
Yeah.
because they didn't have a distribution channel that was built for them, right?
Yeah.
So really most of the best business success stories are where somebody's run into a problem that needed to be solved and at some point got fed up with it and decided to solve it. We're very clearly a distribution platform built by CPG founders for CPG founders.
Mhm.
The challenge is that some people do need to learn things the hard way. And some people that are looking at this for the very first time with fresh eyes and no experience have to go through some of the pain points of distribution first to understand what it is that they need and what they're looking for. But we're there for them, really. A lot of the brands that we spend the most time on are brands that have never been in distribution before at all. So they have no frame of reference. So they look at our vendor dashboard and it says that they've got this many orders from this many stores, and this Sprout store ordered $512 and this Fresh Time store ordered $266. They don't have a frame of reference to know that that's something that they can only see with Pod Foods. They
Right.
don't,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so all they know is, well, wait a minute, I don't understand. This store ordered $500 and this other store didn't order at all. Something's wrong. Well, maybe something is wrong. Maybe that store forgot to order something. Maybe that buyer from that store was out sick today, or maybe they don't need any product and they just didn't order anything right now. But that information
Yeah.
in the hands of an early stage brand who has no experience in distribution can be overwhelming. And that's not our intent at all. Our intent is to just be completely transparent and open door to show everybody exactly what's going on in the business. And that's where we spend a lot of our time helping brands understand what it is that they're looking at, and they can piece together what they
Yeah.
have in.
That's great that you've got that dashboard. I know, again, I can just kind of like to share an experience that's counter to sort of what you're talking about. You launch a product in a new retailer. If they've got 10 locations, you've got product, we're just picking on KeHE today. Product goes into KeHE and some of it is moved, but not all of it is moved. And there's no visibility of which locations have received my product and which ones haven't. There's no ability to follow up and check in with that buyer and say, hey, I noticed that you haven't gotten a delivery of our product yet. We're launching in store. You've got customers eager to buy, no product on the shelf, and your hands are tied, and so it's a quite a different experience than what you're describing, with having specific information that's visible for founders to see. And then in the Pod Foods model, the brand gets paid after the retailer places an order. And I know you pay twice a month, which I actually think is quite nice because brands can count on when they'll get paid, and they have insight into how much exactly is that going to be.
Right. They know how much it's going to be. Some of them monitor that multiple times a day, which is totally fine. That would be very nerve-wracking to me, but if they choose to, they can. And they know how much they're getting paid, and they know when they're getting paid, and there's no mystery to that. What we're doing is not that complicated, but it is bold.
Yeah.
It's bold to try to take on the juggernaut like that. And the way to do it is not to go head to head, not to try to be the primary. It's just, let's just carve out the niche.
Yeah.
Let's coexist, and let's be the solution for the 5% of the supply chain that really needs it, and call it a day. That's still a few $1 billion of addressable market, so we're good with that, and
Yeah.
and we don't need to touch the rest of it. And then that's been our mindset, and we've got plenty of work to do, but it's on the right path.
So I have a couple specific questions for you before we wrap up about Pod Foods. So one is, let's say a brand is just regional. They're focusing on one specific region. They're not trying to be national right now. Would they be someone potentially that would be a good fit for Pod Foods?
Sure. I mean, I would say to them that they should also look at regional distributors. Our biggest advantage is that we can go national with them and for them, and a regional can't. But if they happen to have a really good regional distributor in their backyard that already distributes to the customers that they want, then they should look at that too.
Yeah.
But if they want to future-proof the business without ever having to reinvent the supply chain, then we can help them with that. And we have plenty of brands that are only active in one of our DCs, and they pay the same price as anybody else would, and we're happy to have them.
Yeah. Another question is, and I didn't get to do as deep of a dive as I wanted to on this, but I know that there's some different, I think it seems like different types of services that you provide, in that there's like, obviously you're doing some distribution. I don't know, tell me about the different sort of ways that brands can work with you, because it seems like there's like maybe one or two different
Sure.
ways.
Yeah, we have two interconnected parts of our business. One is called Pod Direct. It's a B2B dropship marketplace that functions very much in the same way that Faire.com does.
Okay.
And then we have a Pod Express business, which functions very much in the same way that UNFI and KeHE do, but with the differences that I've described. So the key is that we offer both of those together seamlessly. We have accounts that order both Pod Direct and Pod Express at the same time.
Okay.
We have some brands that are on Pod Direct only because they're just graduating from direct to consumer into retail for the first time. They would otherwise be on Faire or another dropship platform.
Yep.
But by being on board with us, we have pre-solved the question of how are they going to scale their business when they graduate out of dropship, which saves them a step and saves them a lot of time and money. So those two platforms are both seamlessly integrated from the vendor's perspective and the retailer's perspective on the dashboards. They're all seamless. You can sort and filter between them, but they function interchangeably.
It's interesting. And then on the topic of like Faire, I was reading, there were some updates about something called objective search. And I guess I'm going to call it a little issue that I have with like Faire in particular, because it was more popularly used amongst our community, is that the algorithm and the requirements for sort of maintaining what they called a top shop were a bit arbitrary. The most helpful to some brands, right? If you don't have a new product to launch, and that's suddenly a requirement to remain a top shop, that's pretty crappy. You know what I mean? Now you got to come up with like something to put there and it's a distraction. And, I was curious about, I know objective search is sort of like native language, and it seems like there's improvements for the searcher. Can you talk a little bit about like the ability for retailers to find new product within Pod Foods and sort of maybe what that search might improve for
I
them?
mean, we've gone to pretty good lengths to make Pod Direct very democratic. And we do have a section of new items. We onboard over 100 brands every month. Last month, we onboarded 170 brands to our platform. So we have plenty of new products to show, but there's a section for that.
Yeah.
And then in general, it's search by category, search by alphabet, and we've intentionally kept it very simple and very democratic. There's no pay to play, and there's no monetization of advertising or search on our platform. And it's by design. It's not that we couldn't monetize that. It's just that we need to show brands that anyone is welcome and that anyone can succeed on the platform.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you so much for your time. We're going to link to Pod Foods in the show notes. And I know, people might be eager to learn more, but Peter, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Have a good
Want to hear more? When you support the Good Food CFO podcast through your Baba Yacht membership, you'll get access to our archive of bonus clips, including 2 exclusive conversations from this episode. Just click the link in the show notes or visit thegoodfoodcfo.com and click on podcast bonus clips.
Thank you for joining us here today. If you enjoyed this episode or found it helpful or inspiring in any way, please share it with your founder friends on social and rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. It's the #1 way to help good food founders find the show. We'll be back with a brand new episode next week.